Welcome to Rocket Ship, the podcast where web developers learn the skills and secrets to ship awesome mobile apps. I'm, as always, Simon Grimm, creator of Galaxies.dev, and today's guest is Cedric van Putten from the Netherlands, who is working for and at Expo, gives awesome presentations around the globe, and of course contributes to many of the tools we already love from Expo. Thank you, Cedric, for joining me today.
Yeah, pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me.
It's awesome because I hope we can get some insights directly from the Expo core into the cutting edge stuff you're working on. And I hope you can give us some information about the other tools you've been teasing. There's a lot going on with Expo SDK 49. You just, actually, a few weeks ago, when this episode goes live, you had the Expo launch party, teasing more stuff. But before we get into all of that, I have a very specific question for you. Could you let me know if I want a job at Expo, is it hard to get a job, from your experience? Could you let me know?
So, my journey at Expo is also pretty interesting. Because I didn't start at Expo like right away. I worked at another job at a startup incubator for 7 years. But then we were starting using Expo, and it was around I would say SDK 12, so it was fairly new. It was back in the days, everything was slightly different than it is now. But since we were working with multiple teams and fast iteration, I started building on tools to help the workflow or the development with Expo. At a point where I started to get in contact with Expo, I went to the first app.js conf, and from there I just fully started working on Expo instead. That's how I got there. I'm sure you can get there too as well.
Yeah, I heard from one of our first guests that your initial recruitment process didn't went well, that you failed your first interview.
Oh, yeah, massively. Yeah. But I recovered in other areas, I would say.
Definitely true. So if I look you up online, I can find very little information. Could you let me know, or let us all know, what you're actually doing at Expo?
Oh, yeah, that's a bit hard to define. It's pretty much everything. As in, I joined Expo to work on customer relations and customer success. I did that for a while, and then I slowly moved back to engineering, what I originally was doing at my previous job as well. But since Expo has so many different areas, we have the open source project called Expo, which is Expo itself as you know it. Then we have EAS, which is our services, which is closed source, but mostly backend related. Then we have Snack, we have CLI, VS Code, GitHub Actions, pretty much anything related to there I work on. So it's a lot, yeah.
So how big is the Expo team that actually manages? I'm sometimes fascinated, and because you tell me all these services, and then you say, yeah, we're 8 people or something.
Oh, yeah. No, we're bigger than that, but yeah, it's not a lot for the amount we need to cover. We work together with Software Mention on the SDK side, where we have a variable team at Software Mention working on Expo. But overall, I would say we have now 30 people, around 30 people.
In total, or
In total,
developers?
yeah.
Yeah, that's still it's still crazy, because I assume you also have enterprise sales for EAS going on. There are at least a few people,
Yes.
and if you say 30, it's basically 12 core developers maybe, or something like that.
Oh, almost all of us are developers, and
That's cool.
there are some new people coming in that are less developer related. They're more marketing or whatever, but
You're
more news
growing.
on that later. But most of us are just developers who are trying to do marketing with tweets, or trying to do newsletters and those kind of things.
Yeah. Let me know what works. I'm still trying to figure that out.
Everybody still is.
So I always have the appointment in my calendar where the guest can put in a topic for the podcast, and you vaguely put in that one question. So I do have a question on my mind, but what was the one question you were thinking about when you scheduled that podcast?
So when I was in London, I got this mysterious message from both you and David Lerieux, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah. He was like the first guest, right?
Yeah, you were both asking like, "Hey, could you come on without preparation for one question?"
Yeah, I guess he was referring to the interview stuff as well, because he
Yeah,
pointed it out.
yeah.
Yeah, but I guess my question that I was have thought of was my current popular video. Should you use Expo in 2023? Could you
Oh,
give? Yeah, maybe you can give an answer to that as well. Because so let's get a bit technical here. I
yeah.
made that video because when I started with React Native, they said use the React Native CLI or use Expo, and I'm like, yeah, just tell me what's better. I don't know. I have no clue what I should use. So I made my little Gandalf journey into the archives and found the videos from Ben Awad and from everyone using React Native from 3 years ago and everything they brought up against Expo. And then I looked up your stuff now and I found like, well, that's actually completely not true anymore. So I made this video and I basically say, yeah, just use Expo. And there are still people saying, yeah, but the React Native CLI and you got more freedom. And I just want to hear from you. I know it's probably a bit biased, but is there a reason not to use Expo anymore?
I mean, the short answer will be no. Like we're also still battling with like the outdated information about Expo. Um, I think like not too long ago, Expo was actually featured on Hacker News, and I thought like Hacker News are a bunch of people like always on top of their game, always on
Mhm.
top of their tech stack. Um, and then if I like when I read the comments, I got a bit sad. Like they are still bringing up arguments that were maybe true like 3 years ago, and at least in the like 3 to 2 years ago, or since 2 to 3 years ago, we've worked hard on like removing all those limitations, removing the things that people turned off from Expo back then, like not being able to add your own custom native modules, for example. Um, and we've moved past that. But there are so many people online that still think that Expo is that like that weird JS only version that we once had. Or people bring up eject, which is that for like 2 years now.
I made that tweet or something as well. Like, whenever somebody just says the words Expo and eject, just stop listening. It's completely
Yeah.
outdated, whatever is in that post or tweet.
Yeah, so like I mean, I'm also going on Reddit or going on Twitter and trying to combat that,
Are
but
you the person who's commenting on everything in Reddit?
no, I'm not the one.
I bet
If you should be
somebody
able
has
to
like this
spot me.
Expo tag.
Um,
Is
yeah,
it
like
Charlie?
I mean, I think we have Tomas, James, and some other people from
Okay.
Reddit, including Aman and maybe
Oh
Evan. I'm
yeah.
not sure. But I mean, yeah, you probably have seen me answer something or correct something. But yeah, but yeah. Long story short, you can use Expo for whatever you want now. Like there is no difference anymore in the React Native Community CLI and Expo. And there are even some features that are only possible with Expo for now, which
Ooh.
are pretty much anything related around Expo Router. It uses some React, like some newer APIs that have been introduced in Metro, pretty much by Evan, like adding that feature in Metro directly with the help of Meta, of course. Um, but those don't really work properly yet in the React Native Community CLI.
Okay. Yeah, router is another topic, and I'm probably
Oh
going to
yeah.
bring on Evan as well, because that could fill a whole episode on
Oh
its
yeah.
own.
Yeah.
So that basically means if I use Expo for React Native, there are not really any limitations anymore. Like, I can
No.
always go into pre-built or a custom dev client, and I get like 100% freedom.
Yeah, exactly. You have pretty much the freedom to whatever you want to do. Whether that be installing a React Native module that like also works in the React Native Community CLI, that has like native code. You can just use that locally. If you don't want to build locally but on EAS, just install it and build it with EAS, and it works fine. There are like no limitations anymore. But there are some improvements, I would say, over React Native Community CLI. I mean, Evan has said this at app.js already, right? That with pre-built, you can basically continuously natively generate those files. And those files, I mean the Android and iOS folders, right? Um, but some of those modules or some of the packages require some additions to configuration natively, or maybe some changes in the actual code natively. And with pre-built, you can just generate that on the fly. Like if it has a plugin and you add it to your manifest, you can regenerate based on even a new React Native version template, including whatever modules you have installed locally. So it basically solved one of the biggest pain point in like the React Native survey or something like that done by Software Mention in 2022. And not a lot of people, like I would say, know how useful this can be. Um, but yeah, it's like pre-built is also targeting upgrading, not just like the being able to build locally.
Yeah, it's funny how I exactly had the questions. Are there any limitations when using Expo? And you already answered that with a clear no. I mean, what I usually read is like the Expo notifications stuff doesn't work great. In-app purchases is somewhat like a critical topic that's not working great. What's your point on those, especially on those two?
Yes, and both are actually valid. Like currently, our Expo Notifications API is it's basically it has a very limited set of functionality that you can use over alternatives that you can also use. Things like uh, One Signal, I believe,
Yeah, I
has
used
like
it before.
way more functionality that you can use right away. So in terms of notifications, yes, that's definitely correct. It's a, I would say, a light version of what's already out there. But as we just discussed, you can just use that instead of the Expo Notifications API. Like
Yeah.
you're not limited to that anymore.
Yeah, by
Um,
the way, I gotta give the Expo notifications a plus point. So I recently created a course for Galaxies on Expo push notifications, and I found your great push notifications testing tool,
oh yeah,
which works pretty flawless. So that generates like a custom ID on the device, and you put it in, and boom, you can use it even with a CLI. But Expo is also not doing or just can't do what One Signal is doing. So One Signal is doing push notifications or in-app messages on a like huge scale with marketing. You can put your users into segments and different groups and target on country based or whatever. You
yeah,
just like would need a team of 10 developers alone just to implement that stuff. And I think you just having a basic implementation of push is good. And for in-app purchases, I actually used both Revenue Cat. I think that's the one you recommend. I would also say you should also recommend Glassify, which is catching up very strongly with Revenue Cat. So I've been working with Glassify a few times, and they're pretty awesome because they're also Euro based and like the security stuff around
oh nice.
purchases and things. So that's pretty cool. So that's cool that there are no more limitations when using Expo, but I want to put one thing in here that I found was actually a valid argument for learning React Native CLI, and that is if you're a consultant and want to get into old projects from clients, you probably need to understand what the React Native CLI is doing. I mean, that's a valid argument.
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, I would say like that's more in a term of brownfielding, right? As in, like the brownfielding an old React Native app that you inherit from somebody else, or trying to add React Native to an existing app that was built fully native or with something else. And like I have to admit, like we don't do a very great job yet with the brownfield story. I think we could improve there a bit. So yeah, I would agree that's a valid argument for yeah, just trying to learn React Native Community CLI as well.
If we're in the field of recommendations for improvements, so coming new to Expo,
Oh boy.
yeah, no, it's actually good, but I found it to be very confusing how I can build my app locally in the different ways. So, I mean, for people completely new to native development, it's great that there's EAS and that I can like easily get my app on the device. But I was actually initially a Swift developer, and then I worked with Capacitor Cordova, so I always had my iOS and Android folders, and I have no problem getting into Xcode or Android Studio. And I was like, where are these folders? I just want to like open my native project and deploy it, and it was so complicated. Like to do a pre-build and then start, and then it also still needs to start Metro, and if Metro is not running, I can't see my app. Like all this stuff of just like I just want my app on the device. And later on, I found that you can actually do EAS builds locally, which I found pretty awesome. Like I do this all the time when I do my tutorials because I don't want to wait, and it just takes like 3 minutes, and it's doing everything locally. So I think like just outlining the different build options you got with Expo to people coming to it and making it clear, okay, this is EAS, this is local, this is what you can do, that would really help.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's fair. Yeah, I mean we have EAS build dash dash local. I think you refer to that, right?
Right.
That works, but not everywhere. For example, Windows is not supported, and that's because when we generate those native files, and when we build it, we use things like Fastlane,
Hmm.
because we basically run the build with a pre-generated configuration. But that doesn't work well on Windows for some reason,
Okay.
and there are some limitations that prevent us to just like only allow Android development through local on Windows. So we had to shut it off. That
Hmm.
being said, I mean, you can just spin it up in an Expo, or sorry, in a GitHub Actions runner that runs on Linux, and you should be fine. But it is an interesting point that you raised because um, back in the days when like Expo was pretty much locked in and you can only use Expo build, there were no other build options than that. But now, like with pre-build and I mean the Expo run commands, you can build it however you want, right? Just like the React Native Community CLI. So to me, it's also interesting that people like this is actually a very common question as well. Like people do not seem to realize that you can also build directly through Xcode or Android Studio if you pre-build those files, or like however you wanted to do with the React Native Community CLI, you can do it as well with Expo. So, I mean, there's also a point towards, I would say, Google and Apple that they have made such a complex system that it just
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense for people coming from web to build like your build or a build.
I mean, for people coming from the Web Expo Go and everything you got like to get started is just amazing. It's mind blowing how great it works. And I guess those beginners definitely don't care about an iOS or Android folder anyway. So maybe just getting the word out, and I can help doing that in the future on how the different build options work will be sufficient. So one question I also had about Expo in general is how do you make money? Because that's always an interesting thing. You're like, if you look from the outside, a lot of this is open source. I mean, in your case, you already have EAS, but I saw you have big investor names. You actually have Paul Graham, which is like one of the biggest names you can actually have as an investor. So is this like the plan? Is Expo currently doing well? Because I found this really interesting. If you say like it's actually not going well, then people might be scared that like in 3 years there's no more Expo. So whenever I talk to people, they want to be sure that the technology they're using, even if it's open source, that there's like a legit business model behind it.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair question, and I can answer pretty simple. We are doing good. But let's say in case like we weren't doing good at all, the Expo open source project is completely open source. Like we do not use anything closed source around that, so even if the company Expo fails and goes away, you can still build and use the code what's already out there. Like the services might be a different thing because that's hosted, etc., etc. But we are doing good, And even in the most extreme cases that we weren't, you can still use it. It's just open source. Um, but I mean, yeah, our EAS services, that's how we make money. It's not just like building it, right? It's not just making sure we have a fleet of servers ready to build iOS apps or Android apps. It's way more than that because we also need to keep them maintained. Um, as you know, compared to web, the native platform tends to break very often in every goddamn update.
Yeah.
So that's where we come in. That's what you pay for at Expo Application Service. And a lot of people are actually paying for it, which makes us happy so we can invest more time into the open source project and even finding different services we can work on. But yeah, long story short, we were doing good.
Is there anything else beyond EAS that you plan on monetizing, or is this like the main focus going forward into the next 1, 2, 3 years that you want to just stick to and build out, like just enterprise services?
Yeah, so I'm not super involved anymore in like planning and what we're gonna do in the long term. But like EAS is a collection of different services, right? Um, and there are still so many things that we don't cover that could help you improve your workflow around app development. Um, I mean, we have a beta version of EAS metadata that basically allows you to push whatever binary you have directly to the App Store, but also update like all the information that you have to provide on the App Store. And currently, it's just only Apple, and I think we can do a way better job there as well, and expand that into Android or the Play Store, and like that's even the open source part still.
Yeah, that
Beyond,
that should be possible with Fastlane, right?
it is possible with Fastlane, but do you know how to set that up?
Well, not yet.
Exactly. So, like, the whole idea of EAS metadata was that you don't need to set anything up. Like, right now, if you have an app on the App Store and you want to set it up, the only command you run is EAS metadata colon pool, and that downloads pretty much everything you already have in the App Store to a JSON file. And within there, we can do some validation. Like, for example, if you change anything in the JSON file, we can already provide you with the validation that will take you like through 5 steps with unrecognizable error messages everywhere on the App Store itself or on App Store Connect. And we can do that locally for you. So there's no setup. You can just pull and push it and delete it right away.
Oh,
Um,
that's pretty cool.
yeah, so that was the idea of EAS metadata. But beyond that, there are also like so many things that we haven't covered. Like we're trying to go more into the testing area with EAS custom builds, where you can actually um, basically fully customize EAS build for each single step. So you can add steps, you can remove steps. Um,
That was what you released in the last Expo launch party, right?
yes, exactly. Or
Yes, yeah.
we re-released the preview. Like there are so many things still to be done for that to make it simpler or easier to use. But yeah, that's I think a step in a good direction on our end. And yeah, we're also discussing the pricing because well, since that the concept changed behind EAS build, we probably should update the pricing in a way that it also makes sense. But yeah,
Yeah. I heard you. I talked to Aaron Bereskin. We had a live stream about this stuff, and he also said like you can basically now run any code within those actions. So I also said like, well, maybe I can just spin up some random cloud function that runs like a few minutes, and I guess you need to figure out those edge cases and make sure that people don't do things they shouldn't do.
yeah, I think we already secured against crypto mining, so don't try that. But yeah, like we probably need to rethink a couple of things around that. So we just released it as a preview, so people can try it out, give us feedback, and we can iterate on that.
Yeah, I think EAS in general are a great service, and I'm looking forward to what comes to it in the future. Speaking of making things simpler, I want to transition this into a bit of talk about debugging because,
Oh,
oh yeah, you like that, huh?
yes.
So this has been usually like a few days ago, I asked something on Twitter, like, what's the thing you hate most about React Native? And debugging was at least every third or fourth answer. So you are very much involved as well with the Visual Studio Code extension. You unified everything under one extension right now, as far as I can see. What are the plans for that Visual Studio Code extension, and how will you make debugging better at Expo?
Okay, so it might be fun to just start with how that extension came to life. Like,
Yes, please.
I wasn't like I was working for Expo full time for a couple months, and I think it was like during an SDK release that we did where we accidentally forgot to update the documentation for like half a day or something like that. I mean, it happens to everybody.
It happens.
Anyway, so I got a bit not necessarily upset, but annoyed because I wanted to test it, see if everything still works, and well, if the improvements were as good as we hoped them to be. But I had no idea what the configuration options were for the manifest. So out of frustration, I basically looked at how we generated that internally and found a way to slap that into a VS Code extension. So I don't have to wait on the docs anymore, and it is right in my editor instead. And that's how, well, the VS Code extension came to life. Um, I always wanted like to integrate like the debugging part into it, but since we're using like a really weird model for JSC, where we basically pull out the whole engine out of the app into a browser on your computer, it wasn't like really feasible. It would take a really long time to get that working. So we just ignored it for some time, up until recently, where the Hermes team itself were, I think, are just more focused around CDP since, well, they want to improve Hermes. And the React Native team is like moving their attention from Flipper more to the Chrome DevTools protocol.
Mhm.
And that's like the perfect moment for me to try it again. And it turns out that you can actually like reuse the existing debugger in VS Code and probably other editors as well to just connect to your app right away. Like everything is already there since you can also debug node scripts, right? And
Right.
it's literally using the same adapter as I think VS Code calls it to run it to connect it to your phone. There are like some weirdness that I have to offset for, like the protocol is big and not everything is implemented yet in React Native or in Hermes, so I have to make some shortcuts here and there. But even like I'm pretty happy with the end result right now, where you can just press play and it guides you through the whole step to connect it to your phone or to any device. What like if it's a simulator, emulator, your actual phone, it doesn't matter. And then it just gives you all information that's available within your app. And that's something that hasn't been possible in a while, like maybe ever for React Native. But I'm very glad we're focusing more on that now.
Yeah, with Expo SDK 49, you already introduced the network debugging, which I found to be like, I know it's a big thing for the React Native community, but as a web developer, I was like, yeah, of course it should be there.
Yeah, but imagine if it wasn't there. Like
You're right.
imagine web where you couldn't use the network inspector. That's insane, right? That's so hard to use. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I'm very glad it's there.
yeah. The other day I was doing some Flutter work and I tried to debug the network calls of a Flutter app. Oof, that was another story as well. You had to also
Oof.
run a different view and get into that. So yeah, I think that's a great approach. And with the launch party, you announced support for basically transferring Flipper plugins into the Expo world. I think you made like a first initial draft of how that could work, right? Or it
Yes.
wasn't you personally,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, so like everything around debugging, it's mostly Kudo Chen, who is also working at Expo. and me trying to connect the dots in like various tooling. But Kudo is definitely also working on plugins since we already get requests like, hey, where is the Apollo DevTools, or where are the React DevTools, or even the React Native debugger things? Where is Redux? And um, like we are also in a monthly group like Expo, that basically chats with Meta, with like all other partners, like not only just Expo, but everyone, about the current state and the direction of debugging. And one of the things there is they're really focusing on making a solid foundation first. Like we kind of went a bit faster, and I mean that's
Yeah.
fine because somebody has to do it, right? Somebody has to test it, somebody has to improve it, and I think with all the feedback that we're gathering now, we can improve it for the next React Native version. But in there, they also mentioned that a plugin is like definitely something everybody wants to talk about and implement. But like the way it went with Flipper is not the greatest. So everybody wants to take it easy, take it slow. So I'm really happy that Kudo is basically moving fast there as well. Um, but the way you have to open things right now through like basically the Shift M menu in Expo CLI, it's not ideal. And preferably we can just use the same system but open the DevTools with the extension from that package instead.
Mm.
Because right now you have to run npm install or yarn or pnpm, whatever you want to use. And then that gets somehow connected to the CLI. It uses the same concept as autolinking, but it's slightly different for CLI only. But preferably, we just have one tool where you just go for debugging and it has everything that you need. That's, I think, the end goal right here, right now, with the plugins.
Yeah, I think that's a very great goal, and I think something we can all agree on because yeah, just like in the browser, I got everything in there, like all the different tabs for debugging. And I had the same for my React Native app, including like Zustand debugging, something I tried the other day, like just state management stuff. And that would be amazing. You recently said in a tweet something about yeah, it's still a bit wonky. That's related to MS itself. More on news on that relatively soon. Are there already news on that? I think that
Um,
was referring to your talk about VS Code debugging in
yeah,
App.js.
yeah. So, okay, so like I said, the VS Code extension just reuses the existing debugger for Node and connects it through the CDP protocol that's available now in Hermes, right? The implementation there is like the debugger part exists within Hermes itself, since it really needs to go all the way down to the execution, so you can pause on whatever breakpoint you want to hit, and
Yeah.
that has to be very low level inside the engine. Then everything around that is pretty much implemented in React Native itself. But there are some like weirdness right now that that shows up in different or various unexpected behaviors. Like one of them, for example, is if you connect your device or an emulator and simulator and reload the app fully without restarting the bundler, your device gets a different device identifier. So you have to reopen the DevTools as well, which is like one of my most annoyed issue right now. I'm very not happy about that, but I actually upstreamed some changes to Metro for that. I hope like that will be upstreamed to React Native as well, since well we want to use client identifiers instead. So whenever you open your app, you can just reload it how often you want. It can crash without like problems. You can just open it again without having to reload the whole goddamn debugger. Um, but I mean, besides that, there are like other weirdness and really technical issues that might affect how the debuggers are binding certain breakpoints. For that, like we're just gathering the feedback that we get and trying to reproduce it, and everything reproducible gets like shared with the Hermes team, with the React Native team, in order for everyone to like get a very very smooth experience there. So, for example, if the logs are not popping up, it could be the issue that I described first, that the device ID is a wrong one and that the debugger is connected to a wrong socket, or if the breakpoints don't bind or it stops on a very like wrong position in the code, it's related to the other issue that I just mentioned. And there are plenty more probably that we haven't figured out yet. So it's still early. It is there. It should work. It should work to a certain extent where if you restart everything and reopen everything and just work from there, everything should work. But there are some interesting things when you have it open for longer, made some changes, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough because, yeah, as you said, early days, and same for Expo Router. It's also early days for Expo Router, and although it's awesome, there are some edge cases which don't really work well yet. But that really gives me hope for debugging React Native applications in the future. So before we move on into like the last section, I want to cover one more topic with you because I read this recently. There's an interesting package called Native Wind, which gets a lot of attention lately because it brings Tailwind, which by now either people hate it or love it, but it brings Tailwind to React Native, which is in itself pretty cool. Now, I read on, I think Reddit as well, in a somewhat of a spicy comment that the creator of Native Wind joined Expo. First of all, I think that's not a secret, right?
No, it is not a secret.
Yeah. What was his name? Sorry.
Mark Lawler.
Yeah,
I
he
hope
deserves
I
some.
pronounced it right.
Yeah, he deserves some honor for Native Wind in general.
Yes.
What is the plan? Like, does Expo have any plans for Native Wind, or will Native Wind continue to be its own thing? Or because some people said in that radio, oh, maybe Expo is using Native Wind and integrating it somehow. Like, do you know anything about the whole Casa Native Wind?
Yes. So first, let's like before I answer that, like let's take a step back because this is like a library that has been developed independently from Expo. It's a super awesome library that indeed adds support for Tailwind to React Native, which is pretty nice. Like in general, I really love Tailwind. So yeah, I've used it. I liked it, but as with many packages that has been developed externally from Expo, um, Expo can sponsor it. Like, for example, not a lot of people know about the origin of React Navigation, right? Uh, do you know anything
No.
about that? Okay, so originally it was started at Meta, I think by Eric Vincetti, if I pronounced that right as well. And then I think Brent started to work with him on that as well. Eventually, it like got fully moved over to Expo, as in it was still an external library, but we sponsored the whole development of it. So it's kind of like an Expo sponsored technology. Um, I would say like maybe Tailwind is, or sorry, maybe Native Wind isn't sponsored yet, but it's definitely like on our radar in terms of what we look at, what we can improve in the project workflow. Because not only is Tailwind like a useful utility CSS system, um, it could also be like a very very good in between layer, just like Tamagui is in different ways, for users to style things universally. And I'm saying that universally because with Expo Router, we also want to have proper and good web support, right? So with Expo Router, I think we're actually looking into supporting CSS, or that's already supported right now
Yeah, I think it is.
on web. But that's just like that's 1 out of 3, right?
Yeah.
So Native Wind can help there definitely to have that one way to write your apps and have it as an Android, iOS, and web app. Um, there are some things that are interesting that coming into Native Wind v4. So I would definitely encourage to keep an eye out when that's out. I think Mark still needs to fix, or we still need to fix some bugs around that. Um, but think of like things like animate bounce. Like that doesn't work in native, right?
Yeah,
Or
I've
or will
seen, I
it?
think, a tweet from Mark where he used Tailwind animations, and they were actually using reanimated under the hood, so actually running this like in native land, which is like super crazy if you think about it. Like it comes from Tailwind and then goes all the way down
Yeah.
to being really performant animations.
Yeah, exactly. And like there are some other things there as well, but I don't want to spoil like the launch. But there are other things as well that people now do manually. Think of like reanimated, think of other things like making sure you have certain event listeners to mark things as focused. That's kind of a pain, right? And with web, you can just like add those events to every element. Native Wind is trying to automate that away for you. So instead of having to write the raw animation through Reanimated or having to structure your components or your elements differently to trigger certain events, that's automated away. And because it's automated away, it can also be optimized. And that's
Mhm.
exactly where Native Wind v4 is going to focus or shine on, I think.
Nice. Do you have like a rough date, or do you internally like will
No.
it be this year?
I hope so. I really hope
Okay.
so, but I have no idea.
Okay.
But like one other thing that might be good to mention is like whenever you do everything manually, right? Whenever you have the reanimated animations and you want to make it work on web, you're basically using reanimated again, right? Because well,
Mhm.
you already have that large chunk of code. And this is interesting because this is exactly where universal or being native to the platform comes in because the native Wind on web, when we render with Expo Router or Metro Web in general, it is just CSS. It's literally just Tailwind. Like there's no reanimated, there's no weird thing from React Native. It's literally just CSS and your keyframes. And I think that's like the proper being native to the platform. Um, because well, like reanimated, it's nice to have it work on web, but we already have CSS animations, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. It sounds to me like you're also really like interested in Expo for the web. I'm curious because I've seen Expo for the web, and usually people say, "Nah, I would rather go Next.js and use Tamagui and Solito." But you seem to be really bold on like, I mean, Expo Router is great for that, and it allows to do Expo for the web. However, I don't know. Like, you still think this will be the accepted way?
I mean, like Next.js and all the other frameworks are like ahead of us, right? They had a really good.
For web, for web.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. For web, they're ahead of us. They have a really good start. They didn't have to worry about like upgrading native all the time, so they were not like slowed down
A
by that.
background location.
Or that Android background location. Yeah, exactly. Um, but I mean, over time, I think that Expo Router could be a suitable option for web for like most of the cases. I mean, if you want to do like really, really crazy stuff with edge functions, with yeah, I don't know, serverless functions, then okay, yeah, Next.js or even Astro or Svelte might be a better fit for now. Um, but I really hope that we can catch up one day. And when we do, that's like then it's going to be one of the many options you can pick for web right now, but one of the few that actually works very very well in native.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's going to be what makes you stand out. And I assume you would have a hard time implementing something like the API folder that SvelteKit and Next.js have because it's so far fetched from native development because you have nothing like that in native
It,
development.
yeah, exactly. Like it's super far fetched, right? But have you like how many times do you make an app that doesn't require an API? Like
Uh,
often you need one, right?
right. Yeah.
So
Definitely.
it doesn't make any sense for us not to try it because it's such an integral part of development in general, app development in general. Um,
I mean, you could just say like you can always plug in your API if it's a different system. So not everyone wants to build a big Next.js application which has these API routes. Like people have Java servers, Rust servers, Go, whatever.
that's
Greetings
true.
to the Primogen. So do you really want like to get into that field of also enabling developers to build sort of API functions?
I would say yes. Like, why not? But that being said, it shouldn't be the only option you have with Expo. Like, it shouldn't be use everything from Expo and nothing else. Like, if you have a Java, Rust, Go, Haskell, Elixir server, then go ahead and use that.
PHP.
PHP, yeah. I originally come from PHP, so definitely that one. Um, but definitely use that instead. The thing that we want to do is give enough tooling, give enough features around the tool or in the toolbox for users to create like awesome apps and without all the trouble that you would have if you go either native or if you go web first and then try to port it to native. But pretty much like everything around app development is available and you can implement whatever you want to implement. You can externalize whatever you want, but it should be there as an option, I believe.
Yeah, that's awesome. Awesome last words for the podcast because I think that rounds up the Expo vision in itself. I mean, to be honest, it's a quite big vision for a small team yet.
Yes.
That probably requires you to at least double or triple in team size at some point, which is then in turn going to bring new problems in terms of your culture. But
Speaking of, if you have a great idea and want to work at Expo, contact me.
yeah, very well.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a link in the show notes to Cedric as well, so people can find you.
Awesome.
I would love to end this with we have a quick question round, but before we get into that, because you are like from the core of Expo, I would really love to know what people can expect from Expo in the rest of 2023 because we still got a few months left. And from what I've seen, that means we're going to have SDK 50 somewhere around the corner. And also probably like what's next for 2024, any like one or two major or bigger projects you're really invested in.
Um, I mean, there are definitely updates around Expo Router. Mainly including API routes, possibly. I really hope so, but
Oh, already.
maybe. We're not sure yet. Then we have native WinFi 4, which is interesting. I am doing a lot of work at the moment on Snack, so that get finally some much deserved love.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I wanted to put this in my questions. Like Snack looks so old school, yet it is
yes.
so cool.
Yeah,
So it will get like more love.
yeah, it's getting so much loved attention right now, so that's good. And then for SDK 50, I don't exactly know the bigger changes. I think SDK 50 is really gonna focus on cleaning up some long old things that we wanted to clean up, like Expo Classic updates, which are not be like which you can already not publish anymore through the old CLI since we deprecated the whole service. But since SDK 50, we're gonna remove the loading code for the classic updates as well. Um, so if you haven't upgraded yet, do it because you're not be able to load your updates anymore. But that's pretty much around. I would say that's it for now. I mean, there are some other things, but they're unclear yet. Other bigger things, but I'm not sure if I can talk about that yet.
Yeah, during the Expo launch party, I talked with Aaron also about like the SQLite stuff you're doing. I assume that might actually be something bigger you're working on with the cloud database sync and offline first applications. Of course, Expo Router, debugging, Snack, EAS improvements. So I feel like there's a lot coming to Expo over the next time.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
That's great. So that was awesome. Thank you already for all of the insights, Cedric. And I would love to wrap this up with a quick question round. So we got 5 quick questions for you. Actually, I must say I swapped out the last question because I didn't like what I had before, and I adopted something from the what's the podcast from Jack Harrington, the new with Paige and TJ Van Dahl, Front End Fire, I think. They had this question. So the 5th question, kudos to the team from Front End Fire. But anyway, first question, Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh man, I can't answer that. I would say after Disney, I would say Star Trek.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. That's what somebody else also said. Second, Mac or Windows?
I literally have both here. I need to test them both. Universal development doesn't only work on Mac OS; it also has to work on Windows. So
it's so
Windows.
Funny. Oh yeah, you're taking a bold stand here,
yes.
my friend.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been Mac only for I don't know, like the last 10 years. So that's also why I said like just use EAS local, and you say you can't do that on Windows. And I'm like, okay, that's a good point. All right, your favorite IDE?
I mean, gotta be cliche here. VS Code, but I would say Sublime was my first love.
Oh, your first love. I can't remember. Like, yeah, there was Text Wrangler as well. Sublime, Atom. We had good times.
DexMate.
Yeah, that were good old times. The latest discovered package, library, or service around React Native or in general app development that you found over the last days, weeks? And yes, you can plug your own stuff.
I mean, there are so many services or packages in general that I see that I don't take it in anymore. I mean, like Mark Wusafi has a lot of really cool and really complex packages. Software Mention maintains the core packages from React Native in general, like React Native Screens, Reanimated, it's all them. And like we basically maintain the boring ones that just should work and just should be there. So yeah.
And you get all the bad critic then.
Oh yeah.
Everyone else gets the fame.
If one thing doesn't work in any of those packages, well, we get the full load.
I got a quote, a Reddit thread from the other day, which read, Expo devs / maintainers are the lowest class. These are not my words. That was a Reddit rant about Expo just intentionally shutting down like issues and saying this was fixed or updating and breaking everything. So, yeah.
I mean, there's a fair point in there, right? So usually when we fix something, we either backport it to an SDK version or we leave it in for the next release. And I think we could do a better job there where we release more often. Not necessarily big SDK changes, but more like those patches. And we are actually working on that internally to simplify that process. So whenever there's a fix available, people can just release it right away. So it's a fair point, and I agree with that. We're working on it. But I mean, the statement is it's a bit painful in some way.
Yeah. Welcome to open source, right?
Exactly, it's open source. Feel free.
Yeah, but that's good to know that you actually admit that you could doing a better job and actually address it internally. So yeah, if you're listening, whoever brought up this, Expo is working on this. Okay, last question. Something that made you happy this week?
I was doing a really big change in Snack, and after changing 31,000 lines, it worked. So that got me very excited and very happy.
Oh yeah, that's exactly why we came here for development. So when we started recording, we were both on like, I wouldn't say a bad tune, but I was working on background notifications and stuff the whole day, and it just didn't work at all like I wanted. And you also had a desktop which looks like a war zone, as you said. So
yes.
We need to share these happy moments more often. So we're going to end this podcast on a very positive note. So thank you once again, Cedric. This was awesome. I'd love to bring on more people from the team. So I hope to see Evan one day. And you also have some other people on Expo that definitely deserve to be on the podcast.
Yes.
So where can people find more about you?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm mostly active on Twitter. I do have a Blue Sky, but it's Cedric_dev. And on Blue Sky, it's actually Cedric.dev, which is also my site. The app protocol is really, really cool. That's pretty much where you can find me.
That's awesome. And by the way, Dan Abramov joined Blue Sky
Yes.
and is working on the React Native.
Yes, the Expo React Native app. So now there are 2 people working in total on the Blue Sky app, which works on Android, iOS, and web. So a 2-people team to take on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. That's impressive.
Right. I'm going to talk with Evan about weapon and PWAs. That's a whole nother topic.
Yes.
But anyway, thanks again, Cedric.
Thank you.
If you want to find out more about me, you can find me at galaxies.dev. I upload courses every month. We already have all the React Native essentials, a lot about Expo, including push notifications, getting started, and whatnot. Check it out, galaxies.dev. And yeah, well, thanks, Cedric. It was an honor to have you.
Pleasure was mine.